Good day, everyone, and welcome to this online session brought to you by PSG Asset Management. I am Marius Alvenga, and I'm joined today by Melanie Verwoerd. Now, Melanie is a former member of Parliament for the ANC, the former ambassador to Ireland, and the former director of UNICEF Ireland. She's also an author and currently works as an independent analyst and writes a weekly column for News 24. There's a lot of interest in South Africa's political future, so we asked Melanie to share her views on this with us. Melanie, thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you, Marius. Lovely to be here. And hello to everybody that's joining us. Let me just quickly do a disclaimer. I always find that that's important. I haven't been a member of the ANC since 2001. Yes, I was a member of Parliament for the ANC between 1994 and 2001, but then I became ambassador, as Marius said, and then I actually didn't renew my membership again because I felt it was important to not be ambassador for the country and not for a party. And of course, in my work as an analyst, I find it's very, very important, that people understand that I'm not pushing a line, I'm not under ANC discipline. Because I find when I say critical things about the ANC, people love it. And when I don't say critical things, people think, oh, well, there you go, she's still loyal to the ANC. I call it as I see it. And I just thought that is very important to clarify. Look, since you're mostly financial people, or you're all financial people, I think it's important to say right from the start that, of course, around the world, politics influence economies and they influence markets. But I think in South Africa, it disproportionately, what happens in politics influences what happens in our markets and in the economy. And I think it's partly because, yes, the stakes are high, but mostly because it is so noisy in our political terrain. It's just a very, very noisy space. And so what I think my most important part of my job is to distill those one or two factors that I believe that will have the biggest impact on the markets and on our future of our country, and to analyze and unpack that. And that's what I will do hopefully today for you. And the two factors that I think that at the moment has the greatest potential to impact on our markets, there are lots of side issues going on, of course, and Eskom and all that kind of thing. But politically, the two main things would be, first of all, whether Cyril Ramaphosa is going to be re-elected and will stay president of the country. And I'll say now why I think that's important. And secondly, the second issue is then what will happen to the ANC after 2024, at the 2024 elections. So the 2024 one, a little bit further away, of course, a little bit more speculative, but let's talk therefore first about Cyril, which I think is the most important one in the immediate future. Why is it important for Cyril to stay? Because there is nobody in this country, that includes the opposition, that has the gravitas, the knowledge, the skills to take, I believe, the country forward. And I think just about all political analysts would agree with me on that. Of course, there are many people standing in the wings, and particularly also in the ANC, but they either don't, as I said, have the gravitas, the knowledge, and the skills base, or alternatively, they're downright dangerous, if you look at the RET factions. And therefore, what happens the end of the year at the ANC's national conference is extremely, extremely important. So let's just for a moment look who's standing. On the Cyril Ramaphosa side, as far as we know, only he is standing. And just remember, nobody's formally declared, but we know kind of because they're giving us indications, their staff is talking, they're saying things in the press, they're behaving in a certain way. So we're assuming Cyril is standing. A little bit of talk about Paul Mashatile, but I'd be very surprised if Paul will actually take on the president right to the end and split his votes. I don't believe that will happen. There'll be some deal or something. So really on the Cyril side, on the Cyril Ramaphosa side inside the ANC, it's basically him. On the RET side, or the anti-Cyril Ramaphosa side, the space is getting very, very crowded. First of all, there's obviously Willem Kize, who's made it quite clear that he wants to stand. He's got a strong KZN base, but of course the big elephant in the room, digital vibes, right? And I wouldn't be surprised if there's a charge before the end of the year. And of course, if there is a charge and it is a serious charge, then he cannot stand. The ANC has been very clear about that. The next person is Lindiwe Sisulu. She feels very entitled to have the position. She apparently goes around in the ANC saying there are only 3 families, and the one is the Mandelas, the Mbekis, and the Sisulus. And the Mbekis and the Mandelas have had their chance. It's now the time for the Sisulus. Doesn't go down so well. People are not. She's not that popular inside the ANC, and we saw what happened with her the last time. And I don't believe she's going anyway, so I'm not concerned about her. The media sometimes throws Ace's name in there, Ace Magashule. Ace can't actually stand according to the ANC's new rules because he's charged, and the penalty for if he's found guilty will be could be more than 6 months jail sentence. So Ace is not on the cards, and I think people should just be very clear about that. Interestingly, the whole MDZ thing that's suddenly coming back into play, but again, it's a bizarre kind of thing if she's actually going to stand. And I don't actually think she's in any way a real threat to Cyril. Also remember, if you're the sitting president or the incumbent, it's always much harder to suddenly unseat that person. It's different when it was like last time at Nasrec, when in fact it could, both had an equal chance for that matter. But that's not the case now. Cyril's the sitting president, so it's a lot harder to get rid of him. Just to remind, I know most of you will know this, but just to remind you that it's extremely important to remember that whether Cyril stays on as president in the ANC is only up to the ANC. Stating the obvious, but often when you look at the media and analysts and so on, it's hard, their opinions become so grandiose and they will say the weirdest things and you kind of start believing what they're saying rather than just remembering all that really matters is not what the media thinks, it's not what analysts think, is really what ANC members think. And remember, it's a pure numbers game inside the ANC. The ANC works bottom up, unlike the DA that works top down, where you go for interviews if you want to stand for certain positions. There are committees, the Federal Council and so on. Within the ANC, it's purely about numbers. So it's about provincial delegations that goes to the national conference. Those provincial delegations are determined by the sizes of them are determined about the size of membership in that province. And the delegates who go to national conference vote according to provincial mandates. Even though they each go individually and their vote is secret, that's very much expected of them to vote according to the provincial mandates because they are there to present the provinces. And that's why analysts often look, and especially closer to conference, very much at membership numbers. We don't have it yet. They only release it very close to conference. And then secondly, of course, where the provinces stand. So very important to remember that. So how does it look for Cyril then if we look a little bit closer to everything? Most provinces have now had their conferences. The Western Cape and the Free State haven't. It's fine. The Western Cape is so irrelevant at the moment because they're so small, and Free State is not going to upset the whole apple cart. All the provinces, with the exception of KZN, have declared that they will go Cyril's way and will support him for a second term, excuse me. KZN even, and we know that the KZN provincial election did not go Cyril's way. We knew it wouldn't. We saw that the biggest regions in the province was not going for Cyril, so we knew then that it wouldn't happen at the provincial level. But even they have started to say that they might actually support Cyril for a second term in exchange for other positions on the top 6. Do remember that at Nasrec, KZN for the first time ever did not actually have somebody in the top 6, and being at that stage they were by far the biggest province. It's not so clear cut anymore. In fact, they're most probably not the biggest province anymore, but or they haven't been, that can still change as it leads up to conference. But so they were very upset about that, and they're demanding now to have at least one secure position, possibly 2 in the top 6. And of course this is Cyril's really comfortable space to negotiate positions and negotiate deals and that kind of thing. So even though we were hearing all those names coming out of KZN, Zweli, NDZ and so on, it is possible that even KZN can support Cyril. But even if they don't, he's got enough support on the other side. So this is really an uphill battle for the RET faction when it comes to the presidential position. And their main problem is that cleverly, and I think this was mostly orchestrated by the president, very cleverly, the NEC has decided that if you have been found guilty of any disciplinary proceeding in the ANC, or if you have been charged by any court of law that potentially, they say of a serious crime, and they define serious crime as that you could get a jail sentence longer than 6 months, or if you've been asked to step aside, you can't stand. And of course, with that, they really threw a spanner in the works for the RET faction, because Ace Magashule's plan was always delay his court case as long as possible. Then when it comes to conference, make a big comeback and basically either from the floor or from the background just take over and for them to then all the RET faction to win, and then of course his problems will hopefully go away according to him. They can't do that anymore. So that's a big problem for the RET faction. And that's why you kind of hear all the grumblings around the step aside rules and so on, but it's not going anywhere. Of course, the president, Cyril Ramaphosa, has some of his own problems, right? The first one being that Luthuli House is in disarray. So the ANC headquarters, and that's problematic because of the membership issue, because that is so important and he needs to stay on top of that. Secondly, of course, the ANC is a huge financial crisis. And that's a problem, right? That's a really big problem for them. Although that I'm sure that will be sorted between him and his rich friends, at least to have a conference, etc. And then, of course, the big elephant in the room is Phala Phala. Again, we could speak about Phala Phala for a whole hour. I'm not going to do that. Marius, if you feel it's important, we can come back to that in question time. But just to say again, to remind you that it's not about what the media thinks. It's not about what any investigative journalist thinks. It's not about what analysts think. It's about what the members of the ANC think about Phala Phala. For now, at least for now. And I am still part of some of the WhatsApp groups, and particularly our former MPs, both ANC and multi-party. And, you know, it just hasn't made a blip. Phala Phala has not featured on those groups. Right in the beginning, there was like, this is clearly a political motivated thing. This is nonsense. And that's that. It doesn't even come back. It's not featuring there and so on, which gives you an indication that it's not a big problem for the majority of ANC people. And that's certainly, yes, I mean, if the only real big problem will be if there's actually a charge against the president, and he himself said then he will step aside. But the likelihood of any of that happening at all, first of all, but secondly, if it is going to happen before the end of the year, is virtually null. So I don't believe that that's going to impact in any significant way before on the presidential election in terms of the ANC's conference. Just one point aside, and this is an example of the noise that one needs to distinguish between, is the whole question around impeachment in Parliament. I got a lot of questions from overseas investors about that. They freaked a little bit, and I think the Rand even blipped a little bit at the day when that was announced. It's noise, largely, and the reason for that is that the reason why they're pursuing this in Parliament is because the rules of Parliament says that if any political party, and in this case it's the one-man band of the ATM, presents to the Speaker a possibility of a serious problem, she's obliged to take it through the process. And the process they put in place was for the impeachment of the Public Protector, which is first that they do this panel of independent experts, which we know now have been appointed. The former Chief Justice is leading that. This panel of experts then looks at the evidence presented to them by the complainant, the political party. They then decide if they think there is a reasonable probability that there is reasons for impeachment. They then, if they do believe that, they then refer it to a multi-party parliamentary committee, which is set up. And, you know, we're just going through that with the Public Protector. And then and the point is that that multi-party committee will be a majority ANC. And then what happens is they do all the stuff and then they make a recommendation to Parliament. And then you still have to vote 2/3 of Parliament has to agree to it. So the likelihood of that is in my view, zero, or very, very, very small, depending on what happens in the next few months. But certainly it won't happen before the end of the year. And it's one of those things which are more noise than actually reality, and that we don't need to concern ourselves about too much at this stage. So if you take all of that into account, Cyril Ramaphosa will be, in my mind, unless something very catastrophic happens before the end of the year, will be elected again for a second term as ANC president. big fight is going to be on it's going to be about the extra positions, the rest of the top 6 and the rest of the NEC. And here's the thing. The one thing that is interesting about that, I'm not going to go into all the names, etc. The thing that is interesting, though, is that they've changed the rules. So in the past, there were only 2 rounds of elections, top 6 and then the rest of the NEC. Now they've changed that. And what they have done is that they have put the positions in. The first round is the major positions. So the president, the chairperson of the party, the secretary general, and the treasurer general. They're going to vote for that first. In the past, if you stood for any position in the top 6, you couldn't stand for another one. So if you decided to oppose the president, you couldn't stand as chair or anything else. However, what they are doing now is they're splitting that, and they're saying they're splitting it because they want to do away with, or at least minimize the influence of slates. And so what they will do then is then only vote for the second position, so the deputy president and the deputy SG, and then what that can happen is those who fell out in the first round can stand for that again. And that's partly why there's so many names being mentioned. Everybody is now wanting to stand. The other thing that's interesting is that they've said that the top 6 has to be 50% women, which is interesting because I do think that could impact on specifically the deputy president position. I think Mamaloko Kubai is very much being positioned for that as a possibility. Because remember, with last time at Nasrec, it was only Jess Duarte in the top 6. And they want to change that. There's a lot of arguments about that. So in terms of I think the whole big question about whether Cyril will be the next president, there's no question around that. Let's see how it plays out in terms of the other positions. The bigger question then, or the second question that I wanted to answer, is whether the ANC, or whether Cyril would in fact then still be the president of the country post 2024. So will the ANC still be the majority party, or will they have an absolute majority? I guess is the bigger question. And I know with people there's a lot of sort of questions. You know, why are we even still discussing the ANC? Because in the media, and because with the analysts again, there is almost now an acceptance that the ANC is going to not only fall below 50%, but below 40%. And they base this largely on, one, the results of the by-elections that's been held recently, and secondly, then some of the polling that's coming out. And let's just look at both of those. First of all, let me just say it's very, very early to talk about this. As they always say, a week is a very, very long time in politics. But, you know, and we're still very far away. So a lot of things can change. So all I can give you now is sort of where I think we're standing at the moment. The second point I want to make is by-elections. Yes, they're basically the only thing you really have to go on. But people, and particularly in South Africa, vote very differently in local government elections than when they vote in national elections. In fact, it's very interesting that for every single national elections we have had in the past since 1994, the ANC always consistently did better, up to 7% better, a little bit less under Zuma, but up to 7% better in the national election following the preceding, in comparison to the preceding local government election. And if you go on that, of course, remember the ANC got in the high 40s, or 47 was it, percent with like local government elections. So if you go on that, if that pattern continues, there's a good chance in any case that they will go above that. But the point being that people vote very differently locally than they vote nationally. The third thing to remember is that the ANC is now, or we are midterm now, and any party around, governing party around the world, but also in South Africa, tends to do very badly in terms of polling and by-elections midterm. So just to remember that. So then let's look at polling. And there's been a lot of noise around polls in the media recently. So globally, there's a problem with polling. Polling have become incredibly unreliable. Remember Brexit, remember Hillary Clinton. I can mention numerous other ones. So that there is a problem generally. We don't know why. We don't know if people just lie more or what the problem is, but there is a problem. And we're struggling with that in South Africa as well. So just to give you an example, it was basically in the same time period, about a month and a half ago, Rapport brought out an opinion poll. They didn't say who did it. They didn't say how it was done. We don't know about the methodology, which is always a problem because then you can't interrogate the poll. But they, according to that poll, the ANC got 38%, the DA got 27%, EFF got 10%. Ipsos did a poll roughly at the same time, where they said the ANC got 42%. Okay, not that much of a difference, most probably within the margin of error from 38%. However, they gave the DA 11% to purports 27%. Big difference, right? EFF as well. The EFF they're consistently polling, all of them are polling them roughly the same. Problem with Ipsos poll was that they tend to do this, is they just polled randomly everybody who's over 18. So everybody who could vote. But they don't exclude those who are either not registered or say that they will never vote. So you can see there's a problem there, and you load the poll and there's a problem. And people who do this with fancy algorithms say that there was up to 26% of people that shouldn't have been included that in that poll, and if you take them out, then you go way up above the 50% for the ANC. So Social Research Foundation recently brought out a poll which was interesting. It was a very big sample, around 3,600, which was big. They also distinguished between turnout, which is going to be the big deal in the next election. And they said that on a 66% turnout, the ANC will get just over 50%, and on a 56% turnout, and there's complicated reasons why it goes this way, but 56% turnout, the ANC will get 52% of the vote. So this whole narrative that's out there that says absolutely the ANC is going to fall below 50% or even below 40%, and thus that we could possibly have a minority government with John Steenhuisen as president. Yeah, I don't think that's a very well thought through narrative and well thought through argument, and there's nothing in the numbers that seems to confirm at this stage a very low poll, and with very low I mean low 40s or below 40s for the ANC. I think the most likely scenario that we will see is either the ANC just make it above 50% or that the ANC will go just below 50%. And in that case, what we will see, if it's just below the 40%, is that the ANC will form a government with either one of the smaller parties like the IFP or with a lot of the independents. The EFF is an uncomfortable space for the ANC, a very, very uncomfortable space. The fact that the way they're behaving, of course, at the moment in Parliament, as they have been, but also now with the president, does not endear them to the ANC. And they know how difficult it is going to be to govern with the ANC. With the EFF. And the DA will only be an option for them. They're also not obviously very fond of the DA, but will only become an option if there's a very big need for big numbers. And of course, the DA will have to think carefully because, as a rule, internationally, the minority government in a coalition government gets penalized very badly at the next opinion poll. Often they are at the next election, and often they are just destroyed. Part of the reason why I think those of us who've been in the business quite long are not convinced that the ANC will fall below 40, at the moment at least we can't see it yet, is because of the research that was done after the local government election, which was of course the first time the ANC did fall under 50%. But what we could see was, with the exception of small pockets in Johannesburg and Pretoria, where people did go for Herman Mashaba's party, the traditional ANC supporters didn't vote somewhere else. DA voters did. They went all over the place. Freedom Front Plus, Action SA, etc. Independents. Not ANC voters. They just didn't pitch up to vote. And so the point then being, and the ANC is aware of this, of course, if the ANC wants to get more than 50%, what they need to do is enthuse and put the systems in place to bring their voters back to the poll, to the polling booths on the day. And if they can do that, there's a high likelihood that they'll jump very close to the 50% again. Now, of course, that has relationship with the no money and the chaos in Luthuli House. So there's not a given that they will sort that out at all. But that's part of the reason why, like I say, those of us who've worked for a long time in the field are not so convinced as many of the newer analysts who are now totally convinced that the ANC will fall into the low 40s and the low or the high 30s. Is there a moral judgment to be made in this? Yeah, well, look, I don't particularly think the ANC deserves to govern anymore. But the problem is we do not have alternatives in this country. The opposition is so weak and so racially divided, whether you talk EFF or whether you talk DA or whether you talk Freedom Front Plus, that is, people are not, the majority of people in this country do not feel that there is a big alternative for them. And then Mashaba would be an interesting if he decides to go nationally, but time's running out for him. And also, there's no chance that he will, in his first election, get high enough to, in any way, get close to, a majority. Not at all. It's a very, very big, tall order. The one thing that I think that is important when we talk about the next election, people get very excited about coalitions. And in principle, coalitions are good for a country and for a democratic country. But we're a very young democracy, and our politicians are generally incredibly immature. And we've seen that at the local government level. And so once you start working with a majority of parties or multiplicity of parties, your government becomes incredibly unstable. And that's most probably the worst thing that can happen for South Africa. So when people start talking about minority governments, where you would, I love, because first of all, you would have to get Julius Malema, and if John Steenhuisen is still the leader of the DA, the two of them will have to agree who becomes president. Well, good luck with that conversation. And secondly, then they will have to get along. And they themselves aren't enough to form a minority government. So they would have to get all the other, the Freedom Front Plus, all the other small, the IFP, everybody involved in order to form a minority government. The problem with that is just about every day this government could fall then, the national government. And as destabilizing as it is on a local level, can you imagine what that does to our country on a national level and what that will do to investor confidence? It's not good. And that's most probably the best case scenario for us at the moment, is that the ANC is just over 50%, so they're a bit more humble, or alternatively just below 50% gives them enough of a fright, but they're nervous in any case. I mean, they're very aware of these numbers. And then that they have to form coalitions with some of the either a very small party or with some of the independents. So these were the two questions that I wanted to raise with you initially. And I think what we could most probably do now is maybe go into some of the questions that I think that you all submitted. And I'll pass back to Marius. Marius?
Thank you, Melanie. Very insightful as usual. So yeah, as I mentioned to you, we actually got quite a few questions for this webinar. I've tried my best to compile those into, more focused questions so that we don't spend time answering literally, I think it's about 60 different questions. But you did also cover a lot of those in your presentation. So I'm going to go over to some of the questions that our audience had sent into us. The first one, and forgive me, some of these questions are a little bit provocative. The first one would be, should the ANC lose power, should we fear social unrest in South Africa by those that would feel disenfranchised by that? Now, I know you said that that's probably a low likelihood in the near term, but maybe just a comment around that.
But it's a very important question to ask. And that question also relates to a question I get quite often, which is, are we on our way to a failed state? What is the possibility of us seeing again the June riots of last year? And I think that all goes together in some way. So let's just first talk about the possibility of another June riot. For me, I think the thing that we should learn from the riots of June of last year is, first of all, that we are fragile. And we're fragile because we have an enormous amount of very poor people, and of course, we have a huge Gini coefficient. If it's not the worst in the world, it's the second worst in the world. And if you have such a big population that are poor and unemployed, and you still have a lot of wealth, and even though it's not 100% true, but there's also a perception that that goes together with race, and given our history, it's a very dangerous position to be. So I think that's the first thing that we have to acknowledge, that we could see that again. The second one is a more optimistic one, and this is what really surprised me last year and pleasantly surprised me, is the fact that the country held. Given what I've just said about the discrepancies in wealth and the perceptions of race going with that, and I mean there's some truth in it as well, but not completely the way it's perceived. It's absolutely miraculous that the whole country just didn't blow, and that we didn't see it. And what moved me most of last year, and was just such a good thing for our country, was that it was ordinary people. It was the taxi drivers that surrounded the CBD of Cape Town and said, no, nothing's going to happen here. It was ordinary people who took hands and stood around malls and said, this is not going to happen here. And so the social fabric helped. And I think that is the one amazing thing for us in South Africa. The second question, part of the question, then relates to the fact of would the ANC accept if they fall below 50%? And I think that is what has been useful, important in terms of what happened at local government level. And yes, there are huge fights in the coalitions and that kind of things, and it's a bit unstable and so on. But we didn't see the ANC declaring the election invalid. The ANC accepted it immediately. They did not do anything, you know, funny by marching onto municipal offices and saying, no, this is nonsense and so on. So I think that is it bodes well for should it happen on a national level. And as long as there is a good leader within the ANC, and by that I think it should be, I mean, there are a few, but Cyril being the most important one, that leads the party into saying no, you know, and as long as they are fairly convinced, and there's no reason not to be, we've not had a problem, any significant problems before, that the election was free and fair, then I don't foresee that being a problem at all.
Okay, that's good news at least. Okay, we did cover what parties would potentially be coalition partners if the ANC should need that. Maybe just a different question on that. Do opposition parties need to adopt radical policies in order to win favor and popularity with the current voter base? And like you mentioned earlier, you know, we've got this huge unemployment problem in South Africa. So some of the noises that some of the opposition parties, specifically I suppose the EFF makes, really plays into that voter base's hands. Do you think that other opposition parties are likely to also, you know, start changing their policies to sound more like that, given the EFF's, call it, rise to prominence? And do we even need to worry about the EFF? Do you think they're going to remain relevant? I know when I speak to younger individuals, I find it quite shocking that people think that what the EFF says is actually fine and possible to do. So maybe just your view on that.
So it depends, of course, which party it is, right? So the DA, I think to a large extent have, well, I don't know if they've actually given up on it, but they certainly are not going for the radical black youth, right? They're not doing that. So the DA's messaging is going to be popular. Let me say this first, they're all going to go for a populist narrative, but it depends on who they perceive to be their voter base. So the DA's voter base is not the radical young black group. So they are going to go more for the middle class, the rich, the wealthy, the business. So they will say things that play into that. The ANC will also become more populist as we're going closer to the election. I often get asked this question: well, if Cyril gets a solid win at the next ANC conference, will that make him more free, for example, to do the right things or do the unpopular things? And I think he will. There'll be a short gap after, if he does get the support at the national conference. There'll be a short gap then for a few months where he can do it, but then he'll have to be a bit more careful about doing the unpopular things. So as they get closer to the election again. And then, so for example, they won't do away, then, you know, they'll be very sure to keep the social grants in place, because remember, the ANC support is largely or very reliant on the rural poor. And then if they get a significant support and he feels comfortable enough after the 2024 election, then you're going to see an opening up again of being able to do a lot of more of the controversial and the comfortable stuff. And again, I think that if he believes that it's right for the country. The EFF is a bit of a different ball game. Look, the EFF, it's interesting that all the opinion polls, that is interesting about the opinion polls, is that they all kind of have the EFF plateauing or sort of have a ceiling, it seems, around the 10, 12, 13, 14%. But that depends very much on what happens to the young youth group. We know that the ANC have the votes when it comes to the African voting bloc, and of course our voting happens very racially still, so I apologize for the sort of racial analysis, but it's because that's the reality. The ANC has got it very largely tied up until, you know, people from 30 upwards are very supportive towards the ANC. They still get support in the younger group, but that's where the EFF starts to be a problem for them. And the EFF, you know, their major popularity lies with the younger, much more radicalized much more revolutionary, much more impatient youth that is sort of the post-1990, post-1994 group. And the interesting thing is we know from global experience that people usually only get interested in politics by the time they get around 25. It's usually when they enter the labor market and they have to start paying tax. Before that, they don't. And so that group, that 1990-1994 group, really only comes into play with the next national election. Up till now, that group, even though there's quite a lot of them that could have registered by now, they don't register, and even if they do register, they don't vote. They tend to not vote on the day. The turnout is very low. And if that stays the same way, you won't see a lot of growth in the EFF. If that changes, the EFF could grow significantly because, of course, also our demographic bubble is at the bottom in the younger group population. But, you know, when it comes to the EFF, I mean, the big elephant in the room remains VDS and their lifestyles, right? And you know, the stuff comes out around Shavambo, you know, it's an interesting thing that on the one hand, you know, they project themselves to be a party of the poor and the working class, but at the same time, of course, they claim the right and is often saluted for that. It might add, especially in the younger population, you know, to be having the Gucci and the Italian leather shoes, etc. But so the EFF, I don't think we can write them off on a long shot. But you know, that sort of fear that people had for a very long time that they're going to be the governing party at the next election, that there's nothing to indicate that that will happen.
Yeah, maybe my one personal concern of that is I don't feel like the voter base for the EFF often even pay attention to a lot of the news headlines in terms of wearing Gucci, etc., etc. You know, that's some of the conversations I've had with young individuals, and I hope that that's not, you know, an indication of where this is heading. But on to the next question, and relating to something else that you mentioned in your answer now.
Can I maybe just on that, Maurice? You know, but that is kind of true. It is true, I think, but it's also true of voters all across the spectrum. You know, I find, for example, if you slam the ANC, you know, in my column, for example, I get a high readership, right, of it, and very much engagements and so on. If I slam the DA, that same demographic does not engage, and they get very furious and they are very disengaged about it. And I think it's because we've become very polarized in our voting. So I think that is generally a problem, and it's increasingly becoming a problem in South Africa, that we don't really sit down across the board and say, what is it that the country really needs? And you know, and that's a
yeah, I suppose there's an element of human confirmation bias in there as well. Like, you want to believe that the party that you're supporting is doing well, so I suppose we can understand that. Anyway, back to this question. So you mentioned earlier that the real fight within the ANC right now is more for those top spots in the party, getting on the NEC, etc., and that, you know, Cyril's very comfortable in this position where he can negotiate for spots on the NEC, etc., specifically in terms of, let's say, KZN, and getting support from them. Now, one of my concerns is just that it feels that we've been in this era where there's been almost a stalemate within the ANC, and so couldn't implement the changes that need to be made in South Africa fast enough, because there was almost like this chain around his ankle in terms of having to pander to the rest of the party, and he can't actually make the reforms that he wants to, and therefore we're not seeing any change and no growth is happening. You know, is that not a risk going forward? That's the case again. Can we actually make a difference? Is the ANC the party that can get us to the line? Because, you know, it becomes challenging. I mean, you know, we get stage 6 load shedding, and it's not the first time it's happening this year. It doesn't feel like we can get any of these things over the line. We're going to talk about some positive developments a little bit later. I think that, you know, it's worth addressing the fact that progress has been slowed, and is there a chance that we can actually do, you know, more progress going forward, considering the fact that there's probably still going to be some REG faction elements within the NEC or the top 6 or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, and actually, let me answer what you wanted to say. You mentioned the positives as well in the same, because there's not that many to mention in any case. So, I mean, you have to, whether you like Cyril or not, you have to empathize with him a little bit, because man, he hasn't had an easy ride. You know, so yes, of course, in the beginning, there was the problem that his NEC and his top six was so loaded still with people against him. So that was very difficult for him. But he gradually won them over. The NEC is definitely now solidly behind him. The last bit was certainly those very shocked by what happened during the riots, so they were very upset about that, and that switched them as well. And of course, COVID helped him as well, because, you know, at that stage we had to take leadership from a political perspective. Now, of course, it was devastating for the country, but from a political perspective, he took leadership. He moved quite fast. He could sidestep the NEC and the Lutuli House. But I mean, look, I mean, he had that problem in the beginning with the you know, not having the full support of his NEC, etc. He still has problems in his cabinet. He had to compromise about the cabinet at the time. He could have changed them by now, but he also has a weak parliament, so he doesn't have that many choices to choose from, and he still has problems there. He had huge problems within the intelligence services, which we know, which is very difficult to sort out. You know, to fix an intelligence services, and this is also Zuma's making, of course. He also has problems in the administration, which Zuma also infiltrated very deeply, and a lot of problematic people there. So that's why you don't see, often you see huge incapacity and problem, you know, lack of implementation, even when the policy is quite good. Then, of course, he had to deal with COVID, which was just not something, you know, anyone were prepared for or could have seen coming. Then he had to deal with the riots. Again, that they should have handled, but that was the problem with the intelligence services. Then, of course, we've had all kinds of natural disasters as well. So, I mean, and then, of course, there's just been also the economic climate generally. And then, as I say, the problem was so big, and I think much bigger. Of course, he also had to deal with Zondo, right? And one of the problems for him around Zondo is that Zondo came out too late. It would have been really good for him if Zondo came out a year ago, which it was. It was actually supposed to come out almost 2 years ago. But now he's so close to conference that it's a very tricky situation for him how to handle all this stuff that's come out of Zondo. He will handle it, or he'll step away so that the legal system can handle it. But it's a tricky position to be in. And so, you know, he was in it's not, I personally also believe there have been situations where he should have been more forthright, he should have taken the risk, but he's not had an easy time. And I think that's we have to accept that when we also feel disappointed in him. Will that change? Well, it changed. It will. Some of the stuff can change. They are, you know, he has been making a huge progress in terms of corruption. Really, it's a different ballgame. When I was in, you know, doing work, and I would be walking around Parliament, prior to him being, when Zuma was still in, people were all whispering, they were all scared, they all knew about what was going on, but nobody would stick their heads about the parapet. Total different ballgame since Cyril came there. It's like there's a new sheriff in town, and everybody knows it, and everybody is like pointing out everybody, and it's a total different ballgame in terms of corruption. And I guess, you know, the arrest and stuff has been slow, but that's not his job. His job is not to arrest. His job is to step aside so that the NPA and the Hawks can do their job. And of course, Zondo took, like I said, much longer. So he's made a lot of progress on that. They have made some policy progress, you know, on many things. I mean, I think particularly on the environmental stuff, he's, you know, for him, it's very important to get this climate change things through, because he can see a big opportunity there for green investments and for foreign investments coming into the country. Yeah, but I think the obvious one, of course, has been for us, you know, things like PRASA, etc. But that's also linked to Zondo, and then of course Eskom. And I think really when people feel desperately disappointed, it's about Eskom. And again, there it just seems, I'm not an energy expert. I follow it as good as I can, or as best as I can. But you know, I think the problem is and remains so big and so deep that it's a huge issue for him. You know, it's almost, I don't know if it is still fixable. You guys will probably know more about that than I do. Of course, there was a political issue as well, and that was around Gwede, and Gwede's talking into mouths about coal and not coal, and whether there's personal interest in that, and of course delaying the whole alternative energy licenses and so on. And again, there I am critical of Ramaphosa. And it is partly to do that it does need, Gwede is an old ally, but he also an old friend from way back in the unions, and he also needs somebody to take forward the mining issue and so on. But yeah, I think he could have done more. I mean, he did eventually, of course, just cross him and just did it. But it's a pity that it took so long, and we could have been in a different situation now, at least not completely out of load shedding, but maybe probably in a slightly easier position if he had done things. So there's a bit of a, like we say in Afrikaans, a little bit of a ja nee antwoord on this. As I said earlier, I do believe that he'll be much more forceful if he comes through this conference for a while. Then he'll most probably calm it down a little bit before the elections. If the election goes well, then for the ANC and for him, because remember, there's always, and that's the problem with the system, is that it can always be withdrawn by the ANC at any given time. So if the ANC does very badly in the local government, in the next national election, then there is that risk for him. If they do okay-ish, then of course he'll most probably feel more emboldened and he'll move much faster. Let me just say, on the RET faction, they get too much media. Honestly, you know, the amount of media that Kolnias gets just boggles my mind. And why, you know, but you know, it's also media that gets bored, that doesn't quite know where to take things and so on. So, you know, just needs new things at times, a little bit of spiciness. So they do get more attention than they deserve, I think, often. I think the story about Zuma wanting to enter politics again, it's an interesting one, but he can't, you know, he can't because he's charged. So people also forget to put the detail in, sometimes the journalists. So the RET faction is becoming weaker and weaker, and their main break was actually the riots, where we see the ANC just was devastated about what happened, truly shocked. I spoke to many people at the time, and they did feel generally that there might have been a link, or there were strong suggestions. Obviously, that's, even though they weren't responsible for the riots, they certainly did not help, and thus they were very, very angry, and that really weakened the RET position.
Okay, thank you. Then I just want to get to a couple of questions that are a little bit more, or at least one that's a little bit more investments related. So having been an ambassador for South Africa to Ireland, I'm assuming you still engage with international business and you know, investors in terms of South Africa. How do international investors see South Africa relative to the rest of the emerging markets? Is it a scary place for them? Are they willing to consider us? You know, relative to the rest of the emerging markets?
Yeah, I'm doing a big one later this week, so I could have told you better by next week. But I do speak to them, and I'm fairly aware. Let me tell you that it certainly changed a hell of a lot from the Zuma years. When President Zuma was at his height, I was asked to do a roadshow in America, and it was a very painful experience because, you know, one, it was hard to sell the story, but secondly, nobody was interested. They were not interested at all in South Africa. And it's not that they're not comfortable with risk. As you all know, they are comfortable with risk, and they're comfortable with the risk that an emerging market brings. But it was just too much, you know, what was going on and what was clear to them what was going on. In my experience, what they will tell me is that they need three things. They need to be sure that corruption is being dealt with. They need policy certainty, and then that they need stability, I mean, governance stability. They all feel that it's, I mean, I think there's generally, like with South Africans, some concern around whether there's been done enough. But of course, they're not so interested in the detail and the minutiae. They do feel more comfortable that corruption is being looked at, you know, and at least dealt with. So there's more comfort around that. Policy certainty at times, you know, and this is where I mentioned Gwede earlier, that does not help, you know, when he says that the mining in Durban coal, it's all about coal, but then when he speaks the next week or whenever at a green investment seminar, then it's changed again. So that kind of thing confuses investors, obviously, and they don't like that. And of course, they're watching, you know, they're also watching what's going to happen at the end of the year, and then particularly at the next election. But I think generally there's been a lot more interest and a lot more hope in terms of South Africa's future. and with the Ramaphosa, he's a lot more popular abroad than he is, and he's much more highly regarded than people generally in South Africa talk about him and so on. And especially during the COVID period, when I did have contact then with also overseas investors, he was seen as one of the top world leaders in the way South Africa handled COVID, contrary to what all was going on about here. And South Africans generally don't help, right? I mean, there's a lot of South Africans think we talk ourselves down a lot, right? And we're very critical of our country and so on. And so sometimes I think that actually does more damage than the actual political arena. That was certainly true when I was ambassador as well, which was during Mbeki's era, but and the beginning of Zuma. But you know, I think generally, yes, there's interest. Are we the most interesting place for them? No, you know, and we're certainly not on the center of the universe as we would sometimes like to think. But I think it's certainly a hell of a lot better than it was a couple of years ago under Zuma.
So I think when we had our first chat around the session for today, I mentioned to you how I always explain it is to understand the negativity in South Africa, just think about the we have around the braai. And I don't know, with the load shedding, I suppose we're buying more and maybe even getting more negative because we're having more negative chats. Anyway, Melanie,
right?
Say again?
It's all the load shedding that's making us braai too much.
Yes. Just a different topic here. So the recent arrests of Brian Molefe and those guys that got charged on the back of the Zondo Commission. Can we read, or should we read anything into that? Does this maybe signal, you know, that there's maybe a bit more political will to go after these guys in terms of the corporates that the Zondo Commission, etc., has covered? Is there anything to read into that? Can this be the start? Because that's also the comments that I often get when we listen to more internationally focused analysts and stuff that, like you also mentioned, one of the main things is international investors want to know that there is a rule of law in South Africa, that there's consequences and accountability for your actions. Does that maybe signal that accountability is, you know, becoming more in focus within the ANC and just in the country in general? What do you think about that?
Yes, of course. Of course. And I think it was JP Landman, I'm sure many people saw that. JP Landman, quite a while ago, actually, wrote a piece where he listed everybody that's been arrested. And often when people say people haven't been arrested, it's actually not true. There's a long list of people that's been arrested for corruption, etc., etc. What bothers people is that there haven't been many high-profile politicians, and that's what bothers people. And therefore, they think that they haven't. And you know, I'm sure they will come. There are a few that Zondo mentioned. Not as many as we thought, but there are quite a few that he mentioned that should be investigated and possibly prosecuted. Yes, of course. You know, I don't think since Ramaphosa has been there, the political will has not been lacking to go after these guys, to arrest them, and to prosecute them. The problem was, one, that Zondo, like I've said a few times now, Zondo took a long time. And secondly, you know, I honestly, and I said it also earlier, I often hear analysts saying, why doesn't Ramaphosa just arrest so-and-so and so? But of course, that's not, our constitution doesn't allow that, right? It's not about politicians deciding who, and we really don't want that to start happening, because if that starts happening, we are very quickly down the road of Banana Republic, right? Because then, you know, where do you stop? Or where do they stop as politicians? So you don't want that. You do want what is happening at the moment, and that is that your NPA takes it forward, your Hawks takes it forward. Luckily, there is an agreement now with the NPA, has been there for a while, that they can use on those files directly, so they don't have to wait for another investigation by the Hawks. They've tried to strengthen the NPA significantly with capacity and money, etc. I don't think there'll ever be enough money for the NPA, but yes, so it is up to the NPA. The frustrating bit is, as we've seen now with Zuma, etc., and that's the price we pay for a constitutional and a legal state and a just, you know, state, is that of course the legal process is very long and they are tedious and expensive, etc. So it will take time. But I think the mere fact that we did see, for example, a former president, going to jail, the fact that we're seeing the SG of the ANC being prosecuted, the fact seeing somebody like Brian Molefe, now in serious trouble and his cohorts, and of course that he's forced to pay back his pension. I'm not sure if that's now actually happened yet. Last time I looked at it, actually. All of those, of course, those are incredibly good signs. And not only in terms of what that is about that individual cases, but of course what it says first about political commitment, and secondly, the message that it sends out to those who have access to state power and state resources to say, that's not going to work. You will be caught. And when you are caught, you will be going to jail. And that's the important message that I have. And when I say things have changed under Ramaphosa, that's what's changed. Under Zuma, people were doing it with impunity, and they felt that, they knew nothing was going to happen. In fact, they were congratulated for doing the things that they did. They were part of the general thing. And so what Ramaphosa have been able to stop, and is have seen that, is that we do not become a country where corruption is completely endemic and approved of, and a silent nod from political role play. And I feel very strongly about that. I think that has been one of Ramaphosa's very big achievements, and that was by stepping back and allowing, and even the way, look, it's frustrating the way he's handling the Phala thing by not speaking out and not just clarifying what the hell happened, why, what happened, how much was it, and so on. Yeah. But that's pretty much him. I think the one thing is that he's scared for what happened with him the previous time in Parliament. Remember when he so honestly answered that question around his son and didn't realize actually that the question, that it was a follow-up question by the DA, actually was referring to something else. And then he got himself into all kinds of problems with, yes, the problematic public protector, who then said he lied to Parliament when in fact he actually thought he was answering. So I think that's one of the reasons. But the other reason is that he's a process man. He's going to allow that to play out. This is the way he works. He will let the process play itself out. He doesn't seem to look worried. He's said if there's a charge, he'll step aside, which makes me think he's very sure that there won't be one. Yeah, so that is part of, it's the other side of the coin of the Ramaphosa that will keep our constitution and our democracy safe.
Yeah, that was just my last question, and we have actually run out of time, but just to touch on that, the whole Phala incident and what can one read into that, because the silence doesn't really inspire confidence, So I don't know if one is supposed to read anything into the fact that Arthur Fraser was the person or the informant about this. Is this a way to try and sabotage Cyril? I don't know. I just wanted to get a little bit of your input on that, and I think we should close off with that one.
Yeah, briefly, because one can talk very long on that. Of course, Arthur Fraser has got a political motive. Of course, he is trying to sabotage Cyril because he's annoyed. Cyril didn't renew his contract. He doesn't like Cyril. He's a Zuma associate. He's the one who allowed Zuma to get out of jail. Of course, that's a large part of what it is. If it wasn't, then he should have raised this issue a long time ago, not months before an ANC conference. He knew about it for a very long time, if we can believe anything he says. And of course, in fact, there's a huge question if he hasn't broken the law by doing that. And secondly, certainly it seems he's broken the law by breaking his oath of confidentiality from the office. So yes, I mean, I don't think there's any question around that. I also don't for a minute, knowing Ramaphosa for a very long time, for a minute believe that he would willingly and knowingly have been involved in something that was corrupt. There's two reasons. One is his personality, and I just don't believe it. Secondly, well, there's maybe three reasons. Secondly, the risk. Why take the risk when you're already president? Why take the risk? And thirdly, the man is rich. The man is super rich. He's not like just somewhere rich. And I mean, even things like hiding. First of all, you guys who work with money know that to hide, what was it, $16 million was it originally, that they said, to hide that in cash anyway, you need like a big warehouse. You're not going to have enough space in your couches to do that. Cyril's rich enough to buy a safe. Why would he hide it in his furniture? It's just, there's so much of this that was ridiculous. Of course, that doesn't mean that things didn't go wrong with the staff, that the police didn't overreact, trying to show off to the president. All of that is possibly true. That can be true, but that's not a crime that Ramaphosa committed. Then, of course, there's the issue of the Reserve Bank, and there's the issue of SARS. Again, I'd be very surprised if Ramaphosa willingly does any tax evasion. Again, the risk is so high. Also, conversation I had with him while I was still ambassador, and he actually talked to me about tax and how he always tells his accountants just not even to deduct legally allowed deductions because he feels he has to contribute. So I'd find that very strange, and people, a complete personality change, but also people who are close to him say that things have been audited. They do acknowledge cash sales, which is apparently common in the wildlife industry. SARS should investigate that. I don't understand that, but apparently it is, and that that is in its audits. I think the bigger question then is, of course, the Reserve Bank, whether there is a problem there, and is it actually a mistake on Cyril's side, or is it a problem on Cyril's side, or is it actually on the government who brought in the money? I mean, that I haven't been able to clarify, and I think we'll know once the investigations are done. So, and I think, like I said, the silence thing is more because of the experience he had in Parliament before, and secondly, a fear of, the experience he had in Parliament, and a fear that he could say something inadvertently again that causes him more legal problems. I'm sure it's lawyers that are advising him not to speak. I don't think that's necessarily politically the right thing, but that's where he is. And then secondly, that he is very a process man and wants the process to properly play itself off that he'll help with what he can and be open as much as he has been asked, and then let's see what happens. And I think that's the way he would like to play it.
Okay, thank you very much, Melanie. It was very insightful as always. Thank you for your time, and thank you for everybody joining us online. Appreciate your time, and have a good day. Cheers.
My pleasure, and thank you for having me.